Wrong target, wrong day, gentlemen. In the depths of Seattle's corporate underground, a tech CEO's worst nightmare collides with a single father's buried past. When three killers corner Evelyn Carter in a parking garage, they have no idea they've chosen the wrong witness. Michael Redfield isn't just any dad picking up groceries. He's a ghost from America's most classified military unit. Tonight their worlds will shatter and rebuild in ways neither could imagine. Welcome to a story where love meets lethal force, where protecting family means confronting demons, and where the most dangerous man in the room is the one holding his daughter's hand. Stay with me until the end and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels across the globe. The fluorescent lights in the Emerald Tower parking garage flickered with the persistence of a dying heartbeat, casting skeletal shadows between the concrete pillars. At 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that had already lasted far too long, the underground level hummed with the kind of silence that made smart people turn around and leave. Evelyn Carter wasn't smart people tonight. She was desperate people. Her heels clicked against the oil-stained concrete as she hurried toward her silver Tesla, the sound echoing off the low ceiling like gunshots. The board meeting had run until nearly midnight, another 4 hours of Harrison Vaughn and his consortium of vultures circling her life's work, demanding she weaponize Guardian for military contracts. 4 hours of watching supposed allies reveal themselves as predators dressed in Armani suits. The parking garage smelled of exhaust fumes and something else, something metallic that made her stomach clench. She'd built rising-edge technologies from nothing, turned artificial intelligence from science fiction into reality. And now they wanted to pervert it into an instrument of war. Guardian was meant to protect, to save lives. The sound of her own breathing stopped her cold. She wasn't alone. 3 figures emerged from behind a massive concrete pillar, like smoke given form. They moved with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of military training and worse intentions. The leader, a tall man with the kind of face that belonged in mugshots, smiled with all the warmth of a mortician. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place. "You're a difficult woman to catch alone." Evelyn's hand found her phone, but the second man, built like a linebacker with dead eyes, shook his head slowly. "I wouldn't recommend that. We just want to talk." "About Guardian," the third man added. He was younger, nervous energy radiating from him like heat from a fever. "About your reluctance to see its full potential." The garage suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in like a tomb. Evelyn backed toward her car, calculating distances, escape routes, the probability of reaching the stairwell before they reached her. The mathematics of survival had never been her specialty. "Guardian isn't for sale," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Not to you, not to anyone who wants to turn it into a weapon." The leader's smile widened. "Oh, Ms. Carter, you misunderstand. We're not here to buy anything." That's when she saw the guns. The nervous one drew first a compact pistol that looked like it had seen serious use. The linebacker followed suit, his weapon larger, more intimidating. The leader simply stood there, hands clasped behind his back like a professor delivering a lecture on inevitability. "Harrison Vaughn sends his regards," he said, "and his regrets that you couldn't be more reasonable." Evelyn's back hit her car. Nowhere left to run. Her phone felt like dead weight in her hand. In all her contingency planning, all her preparation for corporate warfare, she'd never imagined it would come to this. Actual warfare. "Please," she whispered the word, tasting like surrender. "I have a daughter." The lie came instinctively, a desperate gambit for humanity, from men who might have children of their own. but their faces remained stone-carved from the kind of indifference that made the evening news. "So do we," the leader said softly. "And they need to eat." The nervous one raised his weapon. That's when the world exploded into violence. The sound came first, a shopping cart slamming into the nervous gunman with the force of a small car. The impact sent him sprawling, his weapon skittering across the concrete like a deadly hockey puck. Before the echo had faded, before the other two could even turn, a figure emerged from the shadows between the cars. He looked like every other suburban dad in America. Jeans, flannel shirt, work boots that had seen honest labor. Brown hair that needed cutting, 5 o'clock shadow, the kind of tired eyes that came from sleepless nights with a sick child. He pushed an empty shopping cart with one hand and held a small girl's hand with the other. The girl couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Blonde pigtails, pink jacket covered in unicorn stickers, clutching a stuffed elephant that had seen better days. She looked at the scene with the kind of wide-eyed curiosity that only children possessed. "Daddy," she said, in a voice like tinkling bells, "why are those men pointing guns?" The man, Michael, though Evelyn wouldn't learn his name for several more heartbeats, didn't answer immediately. He was too busy studying the tactical situation, with eyes that had suddenly gone from tired to laser-focused. The transformation was so complete, so instantaneous, that Evelyn wondered if she was hallucinating. "Emma, sweetheart," he said without taking his eyes off the gunman. "Remember what Daddy taught you about the special game?" "Close my eyes and count to 30, the little girl recited dutifully. "That's my good girl. Start counting." Emma squeezed her eyes shut and began counting in the sing-song voice of childhood innocence. 1, 2, 3. The linebacker had recovered from his shock first. "Hey, get out of here, man. This doesn't concern you." Michael tilted his head slightly, and something in his expression made Evelyn's blood freeze. It was the look of a predator recognizing prey. "You're right," Michael said conversationally. "This doesn't concern me. But you're scaring my daughter, and that—" He paused, his grip shifting almost imperceptibly on the shopping cart handle. "That's a problem." 4, 5, 6. Emma continued counting. The leader had found his voice. "Walk away, friend. Take your kid and forget you saw anything. We're just having a business discussion." Michael's eyes flicked to Evelyn, taking in her position, her terror, the way she held herself like someone expecting to die. Then his gaze returned to the gunman, and Evelyn saw something that made her understand why apex predators ruled the food chain. "Business discussion," Michael repeated. "With guns, in a parking garage, at midnight." He shook his head slowly. "You boys picked the wrong target on the wrong day." 7, 8, 9. The nervous gunman had retrieved his weapon and was scrambling to his feet. "Just shoot them both," he hissed. "Make it look like a robbery gone wrong." That's when Michael moved. Evelyn had seen violence in movies on television, in the sanitized choreography of Hollywood action sequences. This was something else entirely. This was violence distilled to its purest form, efficient, brutal, and terrifyingly beautiful. The shopping cart became a projectile weapon launched with such force that it caught the nervous gunman in the chest and sent him crashing into a concrete pillar. The sound of impact was wet and final. Michael was already moving, covering the distance to the linebacker in 3 long strides. The bigger man tried to bring his gun to bear, but Michael was inside his reach hands, moving with surgical precision. A strike to the wrist sent the weapon flying. An elbow to the solar plexus doubled him over. A knee to the face dropped him like a felled tree. 14, 15, 16. The leader finally drew his own weapon, a sleek automatic that whispered of expensive military contracts. But Michael was already there, one hand deflecting the gun barrel, while the other struck with the precision of a surgical instrument. The leader's arm bent in a direction arms weren't meant to bend. His scream echoed off the garage walls like a prayer for mercy. Michael caught the falling gun, ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and field-stripped the weapon in seconds. The pieces scattered across the concrete like expensive confetti. 23, 24, 25. The nervous gunman was trying to crawl away, leaving a trail of blood on the concrete. The linebacker wasn't moving at all. The leader knelt on the ground, cradling his broken arm and making sounds that weren't quite words. Michael walked back to his daughter, his movements casual, unhurried. By the time Emma reached 30 and opened her eyes, he was just another suburban dad with a shopping cart and a patient smile. "All done, sweetheart," he said, ruffling her hair. "Just some men who got confused about where they were supposed to be." Emma looked around the garage with the kind of innocent acceptance that made Evelyn's heart break. The broken men, the scattered weapons, the smell of violence hanging in the air, none of it registered in her 6-year-old world. "Can we get ice cream now?" she asked. "After we help this nice lady then," Michael said, finally looking at Evelyn directly. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" Evelyn found herself staring into eyes that had seen too much, done too much, carried too much. They were kind eyes, gentle eyes, but underneath lurked something that made her understand why the 3 professionals were no longer a threat. "No, I'm not hurt," she managed. Who are you?" Michael's smile was tired, genuine, and carried the weight of secrets he'd never share. Just a dad trying to buy groceries for his daughter's lunch tomorrow. He glanced at the broken men littering the garage floor. These gentlemen seemed to have gotten their wires crossed about something. The leader was trying to speak, blood frothing at the corners of his mouth. You don't know what you've done." Michael knelt beside him with the casual air of someone checking the weather. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that moved mountains and stopped hearts. "I know exactly what I've done," he said. "The question is, do you know who you just tried to hurt in front of my daughter?" The leader's eyes widened with a recognition that went beyond simple fear. Whatever he saw in Michael's face made him stop trying to speak altogether. Michael stood and pulled out his phone. "I'm calling 911, he told Evelyn. "These men need medical attention, and you'll need to give a statement to the police." "Wait," Evelyn said, her mind finally beginning to process what had just happened. "I can't. If this gets out, if the media finds out that someone tried to..." She gestured helplessly at the carnage around them. Michael studied her for a long moment. "You're someone important." It wasn't a question. "I run a tech company, Rising Edge Technologies. If word gets out that I was attacked, if my investors think I'm a liability..." She stopped, realizing how callous she sounded. "I'm sorry. You saved my life, and I'm worried about stock prices." "Daddy," Emma said, tugging on Michael's hand. "The lady looks sad." Michael knelt to his daughter's level. "She's had a scary night, Princess. Sometimes grown-ups have to deal with scary things." "Like when you have nightmares?" Emma asked with the devastating insight of childhood. Something flickered across Michael's face, a shadow of old pain quickly suppressed. "Something like that." He stood and looked at Evelyn again. "What's your name?" "Evelyn Carter." "Well, Ms. Carter, I'd say your scary night is just getting started." He gestured to the groaning men around them. "Professional hitters don't usually give up after the first try." The casual way he said "professional hitters" sent ice through Evelyn's veins. "How do you know they're—" "The weapons, the coordination, the way they moved." Michael's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather. "These weren't street thugs or corporate espionage amateurs. Someone paid serious money to have you hurt." "Harrison Vaughn," Evelyn whispered. "He wants my AI project. Guardian. I won't sell to military contractors, and he said I'd regret being stubborn." Michael's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "What exactly is Guardian?" "Artificial intelligence designed for protection and rescue operations. Search and rescue, disaster response, medical triage. It could save thousands of lives, but Vaughn wants to weaponize it." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, passion overriding fear. "I won't let that happen." "Daddy," Emma said, "can we go home now? Mr. Elephant is tired." Michael looked at his daughter, then at Evelyn, then at the broken men who represented just the beginning of her problems. Evelyn could see him making calculations, weighing options, coming to a decision that would change all their lives. "Ms. Carter," he said finally, "I think you're going to need more help than the police can provide." Before Evelyn could ask what he meant, sirens began wailing in the distance. Michael had called 911 while she'd been processing her near-death experience. Within minutes, the garage would be flooded with EMTs, police officers, and inevitably reporters. "My card," Evelyn said quickly, pulling a business card from her purse. "If you ever need anything, you'll need to change your security protocols." Michael interrupted, pocketing the card without looking at it. "These men knew exactly where to find you, exactly when you'd be alone. Someone inside your organization is feeding information to very dangerous people." The sirens were getting closer. Red and blue lights began reflecting off the garage walls like a kaleidoscope of emergency. "How do you know all this?" Evelyn asked. Michael picked up Emma, who immediately snuggled against his shoulder with the absolute trust that only children possessed. For a moment, holding his daughter, he looked like any other loving father. Then his eyes met Evelyn's, and she saw the ghost of whatever he used to be. "Lucky guess," he said. The first police car screamed into the garage, followed quickly by an ambulance and what looked like half the Seattle PD. In the chaos that followed statements and questions and concerned officials, Evelyn lost track of Michael and Emma. One moment they were there, giving their account to a detective who seemed oddly deferential to the mild-mannered man with the shopping cart. The next moment they were gone, disappeared into the night like smoke. It wasn't until much later, when Evelyn was finally home in her Queen Anne penthouse, triple-checking locks and activating security systems she'd never bothered with before, that she really looked at Michael's business card. Redfield Catering Services, it read in simple black text. Specializing in intimate gatherings and special occasions. Below the text was a phone number and an address in a neighborhood she didn't recognize. There was no mention of military training, tactical expertise, or the kind of lethal competence that could dismantle 3 armed professionals in the time it took a 6-year-old to count to 30. Evelyn poured herself 3 fingers of bourbon and stood at her floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Seattle skyline. Somewhere out there, Harrison Vaughn was probably learning that his first attempt had failed. Somewhere else, other professionals were probably being hired to finish the job. And somewhere in the city, a single father was probably reading his daughter a bedtime story, checking her room for monsters, and kissing her goodnight with hands that had saved a stranger's life just hours before. The bourbon burned going down, but it didn't warm the ice in her veins. Michael had been right about one thing: her scary night was just getting started. The men in the garage had been a message, a warning, a preview of what happened to people who stood between Harrison Vaughn and what he wanted. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd threatened her in front of a man whose love for his daughter ran deeper than oceans, and whose capacity for violence ran deeper still. Evelyn Carter had spent her entire adult life building walls around her company, around her technology, around her heart. Tonight, those walls had crumbled in a parking garage, and she'd glimpsed something that terrified and intrigued her in equal measure. A protector. A ghost. A man who could kill without hesitation and love without reservation. As she finished her bourbon and prepared for a sleepless night, Evelyn wondered if saving her life had been Michael's greatest kindness or his greatest curse. Because now she knew he existed. Now she knew what he was capable of. And now, whether he wanted it or not, he was part of her war. In the morning, she would call Rising Edge's security chief and demand a complete review of all personnel with access to her schedule. She would hire bodyguards and install new alarm systems and try to turn her life into a fortress. But tonight, she would dream of a man with gentle eyes and lethal hands holding his daughter and making the monsters go away. And in a modest house across town, Michael Redfield would lie awake, listening to Emma's peaceful breathing, knowing that every monster he'd ever tried to outrun had just found his address. The phone on his nightstand held a business card from a woman whose problems had just become his problems, whose enemies had just become his enemies, whose war had just become his war. He'd walked away from violence once before for Emma's sake, but violence, it seemed, had a way of finding him anyway. And this time it wore $1,000 suit and had the resources to follow him to the ends of the earth. Michael closed his eyes and tried to remember what normal felt like. Tried to remember what it was like to be just a caterer, just a father, just a man trying to give his daughter the peaceful life she deserved. But in the darkness behind his eyelids, tactical scenarios played out like deadly chess games. Exit strategies and defensive positions, and the mathematics of violence that had once been his specialty. Tomorrow he would make Emma breakfast and drive her to school and pretend that nothing had changed. He would prep vegetables for the Johnson anniversary party and smile at clients and maintain the fiction that he was exactly what he appeared to be. But tonight, in the quiet hours before dawn, Michael Redfield began preparing for a war he'd hoped never to fight again. A war where the enemy had money connections and professional killers. A war where the stakes were a little girl's laughter and a woman's dream of using technology to save lives instead of ending them. A war where the most dangerous man was the one who had everything to lose and nothing left to fear. The parking garage had been the opening move. Everything that followed would be written in shadow and blood, in sacrifice and salvation, in the terrible mathematics of love, trying to survive in a world that worshipped power. And in Seattle's corporate towers and underground garages, in boardrooms and back alleys, the word was already spreading among those who dealt in violence and influence. There was a new player in the game. A ghost from America's darkest operations. A man who could kill 3 professionals in 30 seconds and still have time to comfort his daughter. His name was Michael Redfield, and he was exactly the wrong man to threaten on exactly the wrong day. The war for Guardian, for Rising Edge, for the right to determine how artificial intelligence would shape humanity's future had begun. And it had begun with the most dangerous kind of man, a father protecting his family. The morning sun filtered through Emma's bedroom curtains, casting dancing patterns on the wall, where her drawings of unicorns and rainbows created a gallery of childhood innocence. Michael stood in the doorway, watching his daughter sleep, and tried to convince himself that last night had been a nightmare. But the bruised knuckles on his right hand told a different story, and the business card on his nightstand whispered promises of complications he couldn't afford. Emma stirred her blonde hair, catching the light, as she opened eyes the color of summer sky. "Daddy, did the monsters stay away?" The question hit him like a physical blow. For 6 years, he'd been her shield against the monsters, real and imagined. For 6 years, he'd managed to keep his past buried deep enough that it couldn't touch her world of stuffed animals and fairy tales. Now, in the space of 30 seconds in a parking garage, that careful separation had begun to crumble. "The monsters always stay away when Daddy's here," he said, forcing a smile that felt like lifting weights. "How about pancakes for breakfast?" Emma's face lit up with the kind of pure joy that made his chest ache. "With chocolate chips. Is there any other kind?" As Emma bounced out of bed, chattering about her upcoming show-and-tell presentation. Michael moved through their morning routine with automatic precision. Breakfast, getting dressed, backpack, check, lunch money. The same rituals that had anchored their lives since Sarah's death, when a drunk driver had stolen his wife and left him to navigate single parenthood, with no compass except love and determination. But underneath the normalcy, his mind was running tactical assessments. 3 exits from their modest Greenwood house, sightlines from the street, the probability that professional hitters would escalate to targeting a 6-year-old girl to get to him. The mathematics of violence that he'd thought he'd left behind forever. "Daddy, you're making your thinking face," Emma said around a mouthful of pancake. "What's my thinking face look like? Like this." She scrunched her forehead and pursed her lips in an expression that was probably accurate and definitely adorable. "Mrs. Patterson says thinking too hard gives you wrinkles. Mrs. Patterson is very wise." He ruffled her hair, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo and innocence. "Finish up, princess. We don't want to be late for school." The drive to Greenwood Elementary took them through neighborhoods that Michael had memorized down to the last hiding spot and escape route. Paranoia. Sarah used to call it back when she'd thought his hyper-awareness was just a quirky personality trait, instead of the survival instinct of a man who'd spent too many years in places where inattention meant death. "Daddy," Emma said, as they pulled into the school drop-off lane, "that man is watching us." Michael's blood turned to ice water. "Which man, sweetheart?" "The one in the black car. He's been behind us since we left the house." In the rearview mirror, Michael spotted the sedan. Tinted windows, government plates, the kind of deliberately unremarkable vehicle that screamed federal surveillance. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as muscle memory kicked in, calculating angles and distances and the time it would take to reverse ram and escape. "Emma, listen to me very carefully," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Do you remember the special words Daddy taught you? Code 7 means run to Mrs. Martinez and don't look back," she recited. "That's my good girl. But we're not there yet. Just stay close to Daddy, okay?" He walked Emma to the school entrance, hyper-aware of every parent, every teacher, every potential threat in a radius that encompassed the entire block. The black sedan remained parked across the street, its occupants invisible behind dark glass. "Mr. Redfield!" A voice made him turn. Mrs. Martinez, Emma's teacher, approached with the kind of concerned expression that made his stomach clench. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Emma skipped off to join her classmates, blissfully unaware that her father was calculating the distance to the nearest exit and the probability that his past had finally caught up with his present. "Of course," Michael said. Mrs. Martinez glanced around nervously. "There was a man here yesterday asking questions about Emma. Said he was from some kind of child safety organization, wanted to know about her schedule, her routine." The world narrowed to a tunnel of focused rage. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing, of course. We have strict protocols about information sharing. But he seemed persistent, professional, the kind of man who doesn't give up easily." "What did he look like?" "Tall, well-dressed, had an identification badge that looked official, but something about him felt wrong." Mrs. Martinez lowered her voice. Mr. Redfield, is Emma in some kind of danger? The honest answer would terrify her. The necessary answer would protect Emma. I hope not. But could you keep an extra eye on her today, and if anyone else comes asking questions, anyone at all, call me immediately. He handed her a card with his number, the same number he'd been using for 6 years of PTA meetings and parent-teacher conferences. The number of a man who catered small events and helped with school fundraisers and had never killed anyone in his life. The lie was becoming harder to maintain. After dropping Emma off, Michael drove a deliberately circuitous route through Seattle's neighborhoods, watching the mirrors checking for tails falling back into patterns he'd sworn to abandon. The black sedan stayed with him for 3 miles before peeling off, replaced by a white van that followed him for another 2 miles before disappearing into traffic. They weren't trying to hide. They wanted him to know he was being watched. By the time he reached his catering kitchen, a rented space in an industrial district that offered good sightlines and multiple escape routes, Michael had counted at least 4 different surveillance teams. Professional, coordinated, and definitely federal. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, Coffee EC Evelyn Carter, the woman whose life he'd saved and whose problems he'd inherited. Michael stared at the message for a long moment, thumb hovering over the delete button. Walking away was still an option. He could take Emma disappear into the underground networks he'd helped build years ago, start over somewhere new with new names and new lives. But Emma loved her school, her friends, her teacher. She'd already lost her mother to random violence. How much more loss could a 6-year-old heart endure? He typed back. Victola Coffee. Capitol Hill, 1 hour. The response came immediately, thank you. Michael spent the next hour preparing for a meeting that could either solve his problems or make them exponentially worse. He called his backup contact, a man who owed him favors and asked no questions, and arranged for enhanced surveillance around Emma's school. He checked his emergency funds, his alternate identities, his escape plans that he'd hoped never to use. Then he drove to Capitol Hill, where Evelyn Carter was waiting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee and the kind of haunted expression that came from sleepless nights filled with too many questions. She looked different in daylight. Younger, more vulnerable, but also harder somehow, like steel that had been tempered by fire. Her business suit was immaculate, her makeup perfect, but Michael could see the exhaustion in her eyes and the way her hands trembled slightly around her coffee cup. You came, she said as he sat down. You're being watched, he said without preamble. 2 men in suits at the bookstore across the street. Another one in the pastry line, probably more I haven't spotted yet. Evelyn's face went pale. How can you tell? Because I used to do the same job. The admission came easier than expected. And because you're important enough that someone sent 3 professionals to kill you last night. Used to do what job exactly? Michael studied her face, weighing how much truth she could handle, how much he could afford to reveal. I worked for a unit that didn't officially exist, doing things that never officially happened in places that were never officially visited. Special forces. Something like that. He took a sip of coffee, noting the exits, the civilians, the potential collateral damage if this conversation went wrong. The point is, you're in over your head, Ms. Carter. These people, whoever hired those men last night, they have resources you can't imagine. Harrison Vaughn, she said. It has to be him. He's been pressuring me to sell Guardian to military contractors for months. Last night was his way of making the pressure more explicit. Tell me about Guardian. For the next 20 minutes, Evelyn explained her life's work. An artificial intelligence system designed for humanitarian applications, search and rescue operations, medical triage, disaster, response coordination. Technology that could save thousands of lives in the right hands, or end just as many in the wrong ones. It's not just about the money, she said, passion overriding fear as she spoke. Guardian could revolutionize how we respond to crises. Earthquakes, terrorist attacks, mass casualty events. Imagine an AI that could coordinate resources in real time, predict where help is needed, most optimize evacuation routes. It could be the difference between saving hundreds of lives or losing them. Michael found himself genuinely impressed, despite the circumstances. But Vaughn wants to weaponize it. Autonomous drone swarms, predictive targeting systems, battlefield coordination, everything I designed it not to be. Her voice hardened. I won't let that happen. Guardian was built to protect people, not kill them. Even if it costs you your life. Even then. The conviction in her voice reminded Michael of why he'd walked away from his old life in the first place. There were principles worth dying for, and more importantly, there were principles worth living for. Who else knows about Guardian's capabilities? He asked. My core development team, 5 people I trust completely. The board of directors, a few key investors. She paused. And now you. You need to assume one of those people is feeding information to Vaughn. Professional hitters don't operate without inside intelligence. The possibility clearly hadn't occurred to her. That's impossible. These people are my friends, my colleagues. These people are human beings with mortgages and families and pressure points that can be exploited. Michael's voice was gentle but implacable. Money, blackmail, threats, there are 100 ways to turn a loyal employee into an unwilling asset. Evelyn's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and her face went ashen. It's my head of security. Guardian's core server farm suffered an accidental power surge this morning. 6 months of work gone. Michael wasn't surprised. They're escalating. Physical intimidation didn't work, so now they're attacking your infrastructure. Next will be your personnel accidents, pressure people suddenly deciding to take jobs with Vaughn's companies. How do you know all this? Because I've seen this playbook before. Corporate warfare dressed up as legitimate business pressure. He finished his coffee and stood. You have 2 choices, Ms. Carter. Sell Guardian to Vaughn and hope he lets you live to regret it, or fight back hard enough that the cost becomes too high for him to continue. What does fighting back look like? Michael was quiet for a long moment, watching the surveillance teams try to look casual while monitoring their conversation. It looks like war. Real war with real casualties fought in shadows and boardrooms and parking garages. It looks like turning your life into a fortress and your friends into potential enemies. It looks like learning to sleep with one eye open and always having an escape plan. You're trying to scare me. I'm trying to save your life. He pulled out a business card, not the catering one, but something else entirely. Plain white cardstock with only a phone number. This is a different number. If you decide you want to fight, call it. If you decide to sell Guardian and hope for the best, lose it and forget we ever met. Evelyn took the card, her fingers brushing his. What about you? They're watching you too now. Your daughter. My daughter is my responsibility. Michael said, his voice carrying a warning that made the temperature drop 10 degrees. Just like Guardian is yours. He left her sitting at the table, walked 6 blocks in a pattern designed to identify and lose surveillance, then caught a bus to a part of Seattle where federal agents in suits stood out like wolves in a henhouse. An hour later, he was standing in front of a modest house in South Seattle, knocking on a door he'd hoped never to darken again. The man who answered looked like he'd aged 20 years in the 5 since Michael had last seen him. Gray hairlines around his eyes, the slight stoop that came from carrying too much weight for too long. But his hands were steady, and his eyes were sharp, and when he recognized his visitor, Marcus Chen's face cycled through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been relief. Jesus Christ, Marcus said. Michael Redfield. I heard you were dead. I was. For 5 years I was dead and buried and living a nice, quiet life. Michael stepped inside without invitation, old habits asserting themselves. Now, someone's dug me up. Marcus's living room was exactly what Michael had expected. Sparse furniture, clear sight lines, weapons hidden in places that looked innocent but offered quick access. The home of a man who'd never quite convinced himself that the war was over. Coffee? Marcus asked. Information. They sat across from each other like old soldiers sharing war stories, except the war had never really ended, and the stories were still being written in blood. Tell me about Harrison Vaughn, Michael said. Marcus whistled low. That's a name I was hoping never to hear again. What's your interest? He sent 3 professionals after a civilian last night. A tech CEO who won't sell him her AI project. Evelyn Carter, Rising Edge Technologies. Marcus's expression darkened. We've been watching that situation develop. Vaughn's been pressure testing her security for weeks, probing for weaknesses. The company still exists, Michael. Different name, same mission. And Vaughn's been on our radar for a long time. Michael felt something cold settle in his stomach. The company was what they'd called their unit, back when it had official sanction and unofficial methods. A group of operators who handled problems too sensitive for regular military or intelligence agencies, problems that required permanent solutions. What kind of problems has Vaughn been causing? Marcus stood and walked to a wall safe hidden behind a painting of Mount Rainier. He withdrew a thick manila folder and dropped it on the coffee table between them. Harrison Vaughn, age 53, started as a defense contractor 20 years ago, built an empire buying up promising military technologies and selling them to the highest bidder. Countries, corporations, terrorist organizations, he's not particular about his customers. Michael opened the folder and found himself looking at surveillance photos, financial records, and incident reports that painted a picture of a man who treated human life as a business expense. 3 years ago, he tried to acquire a biotechnology firm working on battlefield medical applications. When they refused to sell, their research facility burned down. 7 people died, including 2 graduate students. Marcus's voice was flat professional. 2 years ago, a robotics company developing autonomous rescue systems. Same story, refusal to sell, mysterious industrial accident, 5 casualties. And last year, a small AI startup in Austin. Developers working on predictive analytics for disaster response. They turned down Vaughn's buyout offer. Marcus paused. 3 weeks later, the founder's car went off a bridge. His wife and kids were in the car. Michael closed the folder, his hands steady despite the rage building in his chest. Where's the company in all this? Gathering evidence, building a case, waiting for authorization to act. How long have you been waiting? 2 years. And how many more people die while you wait for authorization? Marcus's expression hardened. You know how this works, Michael. We can't just execute American citizens because we don't like their business practices. There are laws, protocols. There are also body bags. Michael stood pacing to the window that offered a view of the street and potential approaches. How many files like this do you have? How many Harrison Vaughns are operating while you gather evidence and wait for permission to stop them? More than I like to count. Fewer than there used to be. The admission hung between them like a guilty secret. Michael turned back to his old teammate, seeing not the idealistic operative he'd once known, but a man worn down by bureaucracy and compromise. I need current intelligence on Vaughn's operation. Personnel, safe houses, financial assets. Everything you have. Michael, you can't seriously be thinking. A 6-year-old girl is being watched by federal agents because her father saved the wrong woman's life. Michael's voice was quiet, controlled, and absolutely lethal. I need to know what I'm up against. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying his old friend's face. You always were the one who couldn't walk away from a fight. I did walk away. For 5 years, I was Michael Redfield, caterer and single father. I baked cookies for school fundraisers and coached Little League, and pretended that the world was a safe place where good people could live quiet lives. He gestured toward the folder. Turns out, the world doesn't give a damn what I pretend. If you do this, if you go after Vaughn, there's no coming back. The company won't protect you. Hell, they might come after you themselves. They're welcome to try. The confidence in Michael's voice made Marcus remember why their unit had been so effective and why it had been disbanded. There were men who followed orders and men who followed conscience, and Michael Redfield had always been the latter. Give me an hour, Marcus said finally. I'll pull together what I can. And Marcus, if anything happens to my daughter while I'm handling this, I'll hold you personally responsible. The threat was delivered in the same tone Michael might use to discuss the weather, which made it infinitely more terrifying than if he'd shouted. Marcus nodded. Understood. Michael left his old friend gathering intelligence and drove to Emma's school, where the afternoon pickup routine played out exactly as it had for 3 years. Children running to waiting cars, teachers waving goodbye, parents chatting about soccer practice and birthday parties. The normalcy of it all felt like a knife in his chest. Emma bounded over with her backpack bouncing and her face bright with the kind of joy that made the entire world seem worthwhile. Daddy, guess what Tommy Chen said? His dad might know you because you have the same last name but different first names. And Mrs. Martinez said that's called a coincidence, but I think it's called magic. Michael's blood froze. Tommy Chen, Marcus's son. The surveillance teams weren't just watching him. They were mapping his connections, identifying his network, building a complete picture of his life and vulnerabilities. That is kind of magical, he said, lifting Emma into a hug that felt like armor against the world. Ready to go home. Can we stop for ice cream? Not today, Princess. We need to have a talk when we get home. Emma's face fell slightly, but she nodded with the kind of trust that made Michael's chest ache. As they drove home through streets that had become a battlefield, he began the most difficult conversation of his life. Emma, do you remember when Mommy went to heaven? Because the bad man was drinking and driving, and angels needed her more than we did, Emma recited with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who'd grown up with loss. That's right. And do you remember how we talked about how sometimes bad people do bad things to good people? Like in fairy tales when the dragon tries to hurt the princess. Exactly like that. Well, Daddy might have to be a knight for a while, to protect some good people from some bad people. Emma considered this with the seriousness of a 6-year-old confronting adult complexities. Will you have to go away? I hope not. But if I do, you'll stay with Uncle Marcus and Aunt Linda. You remember them, right? Tommy's parents. They have the big dog and the swimming pool. That's right. And no matter what happens, no matter how long Daddy has to be a knight, you remember that I love you more than all the stars in the sky, okay? More than all the fish in the ocean and all the grains of sand on all the beaches, Emma added, completing their ritual. That's right, Princess. That's exactly right. That evening, after Emma was asleep and the house was secured with locks and alarms that couldn't keep out the kind of enemies who were watching them, Michael sat in his kitchen with Marcus's intelligence files spread across the table. Financial records, personnel files, surveillance reports, the anatomy of Harrison Vaughn's empire laid bare. Vaughn operated through a network of shell companies and cutouts, legitimate businesses that served as fronts for less legitimate activities. His security chief was a former Delta Force operator named Collins, who'd been cashiered for excessive force. His chief financial officer had connections to offshore accounts in countries that didn't ask questions about the source of funds. But it was the personnel file on Vaughn's newest employee that made Michael's blood run cold. Colonel James Ellis, former commanding officer of a classified military unit, officially retired, unofficially recruited by Vaughn 6 months ago for special projects consultation. Michael knew Ellis, had served under him, had watched him turn from a dedicated soldier into something darker as the missions grew more sensitive and the moral lines grew more blurred. Ellis was the reason Michael had walked away from the company, the reason he'd chosen a quiet life over the adrenaline rush of sanctioned violence. And now Ellis was hunting him using resources that made the federal government look underfunded. Michael's phone buzzed with a text from the secure number he'd given Evelyn. They took my lead programmer, David Kim, kidnapped from his apartment 2 hours ago. He typed back, "Proof of life video message. They want Guardian's source code in exchange for his release. Don't give it to them. He has a wife and 2 kids. If you give them the code, they'll kill him anyway. And you. And anyone else who knows how Guardian works." There was a long pause before her response. "Then what do we do?" Michael looked at the intelligence files, at the photographs of Harrison Vaughn and Colonel Ellis, at the evidence of a network that had been operating in shadows for years while good people died and justice waited for authorization. "We stop running and start hunting." "What does that mean?" "It means war. Real war. Are you ready for that?" Another pause. Then, yes. Michael closed the files and walked to Emma's room where she slept, surrounded by stuffed animals and dreams of princesses and happy endings. He stood in the doorway for a long time, memorizing her face, her peaceful breathing, the way her hair caught the light from the hallway. Tomorrow he would cross a line he'd drawn 5 years ago. Tomorrow he would become the man he'd sworn never to be again. Tomorrow he would remind Harrison Vaughn and Colonel Ellis and everyone else who thought they could threaten innocence that some ghosts were better left buried. But tonight he was just a father watching his daughter sleep, storing up moments of peace against the storm that was coming. Because Michael Redfield, the caterer, was about to die, and someone much more dangerous was about to take his place. The gray Seattle dawn brought no comfort, only the harsh reality that David Kim had been missing for 18 hours. Michael stood at his kitchen window watching federal surveillance teams change shifts with the precision of Swiss clockwork and felt the familiar weight of tactical planning settle over his shoulders like an old coat. Emma's cereal bowl sat untouched on the counter. She'd been too excited about the special sleepover at Uncle Marcus's house to eat breakfast. The sleepover that would keep her safe while her father went to war. "Daddy, why do you look sad?" Emma asked, tugging on his shirt with the kind of innocent perception that cut straight through his defenses. "Just thinking about work, princess." He knelt to her level, memorizing the constellation of freckles across her nose. "Remember what we talked about being brave when things get scary." "Knights have to be brave to protect princesses," she said solemnly. "And princesses have to be brave to let them." The wisdom of 6-year-olds never failed to astound him. "That's right. And Uncle Marcus and Aunt Linda will take very good care of you while Daddy does some night work." "Will you slay the dragon?" Michael thought about Harrison Vaughn, about Colonel Ellis, about the network of predators who treated human lives as business expenses. "I'm going to try." An hour later, after dropping Emma at Marcus's house with promises and kisses and the kind of goodbye that felt like tearing out his own heart, Michael drove to an abandoned warehouse in Georgetown that had once served as a company safe house. The building looked derelict from the outside, broken windows, graffiti-covered walls, the urban decay that made it invisible to casual observers. Inside it was something else entirely. Evelyn Carter stood in the center of what had once been a loading dock, surrounded by enough computer equipment to run a small country. Her fingers flew across multiple keyboards with the kind of focused intensity that reminded Michael why she'd built an empire from nothing but ideas and determination. "How did you know about this place?" she asked without looking up from her screens. "I used to work here. Long time ago, different life." Michael surveyed the tactical setup she'd assembled: overnight satellite uplinks, encrypted communication arrays, surveillance monitors displaying feeds from around the city. "You've been busy. David's wife called me 6 times last night. His kids keep asking when Daddy's coming home." Her voice was steady, but Michael could see the tremor in her hands. "I've been tracking the van that took him. Facial recognition software, traffic cameras, cell tower pings. They're holding him in a warehouse district south of Boeing Field. You're not trained for this kind of operation." "No," she agreed. "But I'm the only one who knows Guardian's architecture well enough to build the countermeasures we'll need." Michael moved to the bank of monitors, studying the surveillance feeds with the eye of someone who'd spent years hunting and being hunted. "What kind of countermeasures?" Guardian was designed for search and rescue, but the core algorithms can be adapted for other purposes. Predictive analysis, pattern recognition, tactical coordination. She pulled up a 3-dimensional model of the warehouse district. "I've been feeding surveillance data into a modified Guardian protocol. It's mapping guard rotations, identifying weak points, calculating optimal approach vectors." Despite the circumstances, Michael found himself impressed. "You turned your humanitarian AI into a tactical planning system overnight." "The irony isn't lost on me." Evelyn's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Harrison Vaughn wanted to weaponize Guardian, so I'm giving him exactly what he asked for. There's a difference between tactical analysis and actually pulling a trigger. That's where you come in." Michael studied the warehouse layout, noting sight lines and escape routes, with the automatic assessment of someone who'd survived too many similar operations. "You're assuming I'm going to help you mount a rescue operation. David Kim has been my friend for 8 years. He's the godfather to my niece. He stayed late last night because I asked him to review Guardian's security protocols." Evelyn's voice carried the weight of personal responsibility. "If he dies because of my technology, because of my refusal to sell to Vaughn, then I'm no better than the monsters I'm trying to fight. And if you get yourself killed trying to save him, then at least I'll die fighting instead of hiding." The conviction in her voice reminded Michael of why he'd walked away from his old life in the first place, and why he was about to walk back into it. There were principles worth dying for, and sometimes those principles required getting your hands dirty to protect the innocent. "Guardian's tactical analysis is impressive," he said finally, "but it's missing something crucial." "What?" "Human intelligence. This isn't just a rescue operation, it's a message. Vaughn and Ellis are testing your resolve, seeing how far you'll go to protect your people. The warehouse is probably a trap." Evelyn's fingers froze over her keyboard. "What kind of trap?" "The kind where they're expecting us to come. The kind where David Kim is bait to draw us into a kill zone." Michael moved to a different monitor, one showing real-time satellite imagery of the warehouse district. "Ellis knows how I think, how I operate. He's counting on me walking into his crosshairs." "Then we don't go to the warehouse." "No, we go. But not the way he expects." For the next 2 hours, Michael and Evelyn worked side by side, combining his tactical expertise with her technological resources to build a plan that would have impressed the Joint Chiefs. Guardian's algorithms processed thousands of variables: weather patterns, traffic flow, emergency service response times, while Michael overlaid operational experience and human intuition. The guards rotate every 4 hours, Evelyn said, highlighting patrol routes on the tactical display. Guardians calculated a 17-minute window between 3:00 and 3:17 a.m., where there's minimal coverage on the eastern approach. Too obvious, Michael replied. Ellis will have that window covered. We go in during the shift change at midnight, when everyone's focused on handover protocols instead of perimeter security. The loading dock is our best entry point. Guardian shows heavy foot traffic there during normal operations, which means it's probably wired with enough explosives to level half the building. We go through the roof. Evelyn studied the satellite imagery with the intense focus of someone learning to think like a predator. The skylight over the main floor. Guardian calculates a 93% probability of success if we can reach it undetected. Guardian doesn't account for Murphy's Law. Everything that can go wrong will go wrong, usually at the worst possible moment. Michael traced potential extraction routes with his finger. We need at least 3 different exit strategies and backup plans for the backup plans. As they worked, Michael found himself reluctantly impressed by Evelyn's ability to adapt. She learned quickly, asked the right questions, and had the kind of cold, analytical mind that could compartmentalize emotion when lives were on the line. Under different circumstances, she might have made a decent operative. There's something else, she said as they finalized the approach vector. Guardian's been analyzing the financial data Marcus provided. Vaughn's not just collecting AI technologies, he's building something specific. What kind of something? Evelyn pulled up a network diagram that looked like a spider web of connections between various technology companies, defense contractors, and research institutions. Guardian identified a pattern in his acquisitions: biotechnology, robotics, artificial intelligence, advanced materials science. Individually, they're cutting-edge research. Together, they're components of something much larger. Michael felt ice form in his stomach. What larger? Autonomous weapons systems. Not just drones or guided missiles, but fully independent artificial intelligences capable of making kill decisions without human oversight. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Guardian estimates that Vaughn has acquired approximately 60% of the necessary technologies. If he gets my AI protocols, he'll have everything he needs to build an army of thinking machines. The implications hit Michael like a physical blow. How many machines? Guardian's projections suggest hundreds initially, potentially thousands within a decade. Artificial soldiers that never tire, never question orders, never suffer from conscience or PTSD. Evelyn's hands shook as she spoke. The ultimate military contractor's dream warfare without human cost to the side that deploys them. And without human oversight or accountability. Exactly. Imagine Colonel Ellis with an army of artificial operatives who follow orders without question, who can't be bribed or blackmailed or turned by enemy propaganda, who can't refuse illegal orders or blow the whistle on war crimes. Michael thought about Ellis, about the man he'd once served under, and eventually walked away from. About the missions that had grown darker and more morally ambiguous as the colonel's ambitions expanded. The idea of Ellis commanding an army of artificial killers was the stuff of nightmares. We're not just rescuing David Kim, he said quietly. We're stopping the birth of something that could change the nature of warfare forever. Guardian's analysis suggests that Vaughn's timeline accelerated after last night. Your intervention in the parking garage forced him to move faster, take bigger risks. Evelyn met his eyes. This is our only chance to stop him before his pieces are in place. Michael's secure phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Ellis, moved to active oversight. 20 additional security personnel deployed to target location. Whatever you're planning, do it fast. He showed the message to Evelyn. Ellis is taking personal command. That means he's expecting trouble. Good, she said, with the kind of cold determination that would have impressed his old unit commanders. Let's give him exactly what he's expecting. As night fell over Seattle, Michael made his final preparations with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this too many times before. He checked and double-checked his equipment, tactical gear, acquired through channels that didn't officially exist, weapons that had never been registered, communications equipment that couldn't be traced. Evelyn worked beside him, configuring Guardian's tactical protocols for real-time battlefield analysis. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They were about to use an AI designed to save lives to plan an operation that would almost certainly end them. Second thoughts, Michael asked as they conducted final equipment checks. Every second, Evelyn admitted. But David Kim has kids who want their father to come home, and somewhere out there Vaughn is planning to build artificial soldiers that will make human warfare obsolete. How do I live with myself if I don't try to stop that? Michael understood the weight of that choice. He'd made it himself years ago, walking away from family barbecues and school plays to chase ghosts through foreign cities and dark alleys. The calculus of sacrifice in service of something larger than yourself. Ellis will try to capture us alive, he said, as they loaded into a stolen panel van that Evelyn had acquired through means she'd declined to explain. He wants Guardian's protocols more than he wants us dead. That gives us an advantage. What kind of advantage? Predictability. If I know he wants something specific, I can use that against him. They drove through Seattle's industrial district in silence, past neighborhoods where honest people slept peacefully, while predators and protectors played deadly games in the shadows. Michael found himself thinking about Emma, safe in Marcus's house, dreaming of unicorns and fairy tales, while her father prepared to become something much darker than any monster in her storybooks. The warehouse district south of Boeing Field sprawled across several square miles of industrial decay, abandoned buildings, rusted machinery, the kind of urban wasteland where screams went unheard and bodies disappeared without investigation. Perfect territory for the kind of operation that left no witnesses. Michael parked 3 blocks from the target building and conducted final surveillance through night vision scopes. Guardian's count is accurate. 22 guards rotating in standard military patterns. Ellis isn't taking any chances. Can we still get in? Getting in isn't the problem. Getting out alive with David Kim, that's where things get complicated. They moved through the shadows between buildings using Guardian's real-time analysis to avoid patrol routes and security cameras. Evelyn moved with surprising grace for someone who'd never conducted a field operation, staying low, avoiding skylining, following Michael's hand signals with the kind of quick intelligence that kept people alive in hostile territory. The target warehouse loomed against the night sky like a monument to urban decay. 3 stories of concrete and steel minimal windows, multiple access points that all looked suspiciously like carefully designed kill zones. Guardians picking up heat signatures, Evelyn whispered through their encrypted communication link. 12 on the main floor, 8 on the second level, 2 on the roof. And David, thermal imaging suggests he's being held in a room on the second floor, eastern quadrant. Guardian calculates an 87% probability that it's him based on movement patterns and biosignatures. Calculations and probabilities, Michael muttered. Let's see how Guardian handles reality. They reached the building's perimeter without incident, which made Michael's tactical instincts scream warnings. Ellis was too good an operator to leave obvious gaps in his security net. Either they were walking into a trap or something bigger was happening that required Ellis's attention elsewhere. The roof access was exactly where Guardian had predicted an external fire escape that offered concealment and multiple exit routes. But as they climbed, Michael noticed details that the AI had missed. Fresh paint on the handrails indicating recent maintenance. Security cameras positioned to cover the obvious approach routes, but leaving blind spots that seemed almost deliberately placed. "Ellis wants us to come this way," he whispered into his throat mic. Guardian's analysis didn't indicate. Guardian doesn't know Ellis like I do. He's herding us toward something. They reached the roof to find it exactly as the thermal imaging had suggested. 2 guards conducting lazy patrols, confident in their electronic surveillance and backup support. What Guardian couldn't detect was the subtle wrongness in their positioning, the way they moved like actors following a script, instead of soldiers conducting real security. Michael signaled for Evelyn to wait while he neutralized the guards. It was quick, quiet, and efficient, 2 men unconscious before they realized they were under attack. But as he zip-tied their hands and checked their equipment, he found confirmation of his suspicions. "They're carrying live ammunition," he reported. "If this was a trap designed to capture us, they'd be using non-lethal rounds." "What does that mean?" "It means Ellis has changed the plan. He's not trying to take us alive anymore." They found the skylight Guardian had identified as their primary entry point, a large glass panel offering access to the warehouse's main floor. But the thermal imaging had missed the pressure sensors around the frame, the motion detectors positioned to cover the drop zone, the kill funnel, that would turn anyone rappelling through the skylight into target practice. "We need a new plan," Evelyn said, studying the tactical situation through Guardian's updated analysis. "No, we need to embrace the old plan. Ellis expects us to adapt when we see the trap. He's counting on us being too smart for our own good." Michael began rigging rappelling gear around the skylight's frame. Sometimes the best way through a trap is straight ahead. That makes no tactical sense. It makes perfect psychological sense. Ellis knows how I think, but he also knows I know how he thinks. He's built this trap expecting me to recognize it and find another way in. What he won't expect is me walking straight into it. Evelyn's voice carried the strain of someone fighting every rational instinct. "That's insane." Insanity is often indistinguishable from genius in the field. Michael finished his preparations and checked his weapons one final time. Guardian's job is to get David Kim out alive. My job is to make sure Ellis never gets the chance to build his artificial army. What about getting you out alive? Michael was quiet for a moment, thinking about Emma sleeping safely in Marcus's house, about the promise he'd made to always come home. That's a secondary objective. They descended through the skylight into hell itself. The warehouse floor exploded into motion the moment their feet touched concrete. Gunfire erupted from concealed positions, muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness like deadly fireworks. Michael had been right about one thing. Ellis had expected them to avoid the obvious trap, so the real trap was designed to funnel them toward the secondary access points, where the killing fields were even more complete. But Michael's straight-ahead approach had put them in the center of a storm they could navigate, rather than at the mercy of carefully prepared murder zones. "Guardian, where's David?" Evelyn shouted over the gunfire, her laptop somehow still functioning, despite the chaos around them. "Second floor, eastern quadrant, approximately 40 meters from your current position." Guardian's synthesized voice replied with the calm detachment of artificial intelligence. "Calculating optimal movement vector." Michael laid down, suppressing fire, while Evelyn worked her technological magic. "Guardians found a route," she reported. "Maintenance stairwell, northwest corner. Minimal hostile presence, multiple exit options." They moved like ghosts through the firefight, using Guardian's real-time tactical analysis to avoid enemy positions, while Michael's combat experience guided them through the spaces between bullets and death. It was an eerie partnership, human intuition and artificial intelligence working in perfect synchronization to navigate a battlefield that would have been impossible for either to handle alone. The stairwell was exactly where Guardian had indicated, and exactly as defended as Michael had expected. Two guards with automatic weapons positioned to cover both the ascending and descending approaches. They died quickly and quietly, never knowing that they'd been outmaneuvered by an AI that could predict their movements better than they could themselves. David's signal is getting stronger, Evelyn reported as they climbed toward the second floor. Guardian indicates he's conscious mobile and showing signs of stress, but not serious physical trauma. That's the good news, Michael replied, checking corners with the automatic caution of someone who'd survived too many similar operations. The bad news is that Ellis is letting us get this close. They found David Kim exactly where Guardian had predicted, a storage room converted into a makeshift holding cell, secured with electronic locks that Evelyn bypassed in seconds. Kim was alive, conscious, and absolutely terrified, but otherwise unharmed in any way that showed. Evelyn. His voice was hoarse, uncertain. How did you... What are you doing here? Rescuing you, she said, simply cutting his zip tie restraints with a tactical knife that Michael was impressed she'd thought to bring. Can you move? I think so. Kim struggled to his feet, testing legs that had been immobilized for too long. There's something you need to know. They didn't just kidnap me for ransom. What do you mean? They've been asking questions about Guardian's core architecture. Specific questions about the neural network protocols, the decision-making algorithms. Kim's eyes were wide with fear that went beyond personal danger. They already know things they shouldn't know. Details that only someone with deep system access could provide. Michael felt ice settle in his stomach. Someone inside Rising Edge is feeding them information. Not just information, Kim continued. They showed me Guardian's source code, modified versions enhanced for military applications. Someone's been working on weaponizing Guardian for months. Evelyn's face went pale in the green glow of Michael's night vision equipment. That's impossible. Guardian's protocols have safeguards against military applications. Not these versions. Someone removed all the humanitarian constraints, enhanced the targeting algorithms, added autonomous weapons integration. Kim's voice shook. They've already built a prototype. Before anyone could respond, the lights in the warehouse suddenly blazed to life, transforming their night vision advantage into a blinding disadvantage. Michael's tactical instincts screamed warnings as he realized they'd walked into something much larger than a simple rescue operation. Good evening, Michael. The voice echoed through the warehouse's public address system with the kind of cultured authority that belonged to someone accustomed to being obeyed. It's been far too long. Colonel James Ellis stepped into view on the warehouse floor below, surrounded by enough firepower to stop a small army. He looked exactly as Michael remembered. Silver hair, crisp military bearing, the kind of cold intelligence that made him dangerous even without weapons. You always were too clever for your own good, Ellis continued. I counted on you recognizing the obvious trap and finding a more creative entry point. Instead, you did something I thought you'd learned better than to attempt. What's that? Michael called back, calculating angles and distances while keeping David and Evelyn behind cover. You trusted your instincts over your intellect. Very disappointing after all the training I provided. Michael could see the tactical situation deteriorating rapidly. Ellis had positioned his forces to cover every possible escape route, turned the warehouse into a perfect killing ground, and somehow anticipated every move they'd made despite Guardian's sophisticated analysis. You're using David Kim as bait, Evelyn shouted. What do you really want? What I've always wanted, Ms. Carter. The technology to ensure that American interests are protected by forces that can't be corrupted, can't be turned, can't develop inconvenient consciences. Ellis's voice carried the fervor of true belief. Guardian represents the final piece of that puzzle. Guardian will never be used to kill people. Guardian already is being used to kill people, Ellis replied with casual cruelty. Your mole has been feeding us data for 6 months. We've built 3 prototype versions, field-tested them in operations you'll never read about in the newspapers. The only thing we lack is the complete neural architecture that exists only in your head. The betrayal hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Who? Someone close enough to have complete system access. Someone trusted enough to work alone with Guardian's core protocols. Someone whose gambling debts made them vulnerable to pressure and whose family made them vulnerable to threats. Michael saw understanding dawn in Evelyn's eyes, followed immediately by heartbreak. David. Kim's face crumpled with shame and terror. They have my wife and kids. They said they'd kill them if I didn't cooperate. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. The kidnapping was staged, Michael realized. You were never in real danger. This whole rescue operation was designed to get Evelyn here voluntarily. Very good, Ellis said. Ms. Carter would never have come to us willingly, but she'd risk everything to save a friend in danger. Human nature is so wonderfully predictable. The warehouse suddenly filled with the sound of helicopters, multiple aircraft converging on their position with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of military planning. Through the skylights, Michael could see rappelling lines deploying additional forces, moving to seal off every possible escape route. You have 30 seconds to surrender, Ellis announced. After that, my orders change from capture to kill. Michael looked at Evelyn, seeing his own calculations reflected in her eyes. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in the center of a kill zone that had been months in the making. Guardian's tactical analysis would probably recommend immediate surrender as the option with the highest survival probability. But Michael had never been particularly interested in probability. Guardian, he said to Evelyn's laptop, analyze current tactical situation and recommend optimal course of action. Current situation indicates 0 probability of successful extraction via conventional means. Guardian replied with artificial calm. Recommend immediate surrender to minimize casualties. Guardian access Rising Edge's satellite network and analyze structural weaknesses in current building. Unable to comply. Such analysis would require override command 77 Alpha, Evelyn said suddenly. Authorization Carter Delta 9. Guardian's response was immediate. Building analysis complete. Structural weakness identified in main support beam grid reference Delta 4. Explosive charge placement could result in partial collapse, creating extraction opportunity. Michael smiled grimly as he pulled plastic explosive from his tactical pack equipment he'd hoped never to use again. Sometimes the best way out of a trap is to bring the whole thing down. That could kill us all, Kim protested. Ellis is going to kill us anyway, Michael replied, placing charges with the precision of someone who'd done this too many times to count. At least this way, we go down fighting. 20 seconds later, the warehouse's main support structure exploded in a cascade of concrete and steel that turned a tactical nightmare into pure chaos. In the confusion of collapse and smoke and screaming metal, 3 figures disappeared into the Seattle night, while Colonel Ellis learned that some ghosts were harder to kill than others. But as they reached the safety of their extraction vehicle, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they'd won a battle while losing something much more important. Ellis had Guardian's protocols now, even if he didn't have Evelyn. The war for the future of artificial intelligence was far from over. And somewhere in the ruins of the warehouse, among the twisted metal and concrete dust, lay the pieces of whatever innocence they'd all carried into this fight. The safe house in Ballard smelled of dust and desperation, its boarded windows filtering the morning light into prison bar shadows across the concrete floor. David Kim sat hunched in a corner, his face a map of guilt and terror that made Michael's tactical instincts scream warnings about compromised assets and security breaches. Evelyn paced between computer terminals like a caged predator, her fingers flying across keyboards as she tried to salvage something from the wreckage of everything she'd built. Guardian's core architecture is completely compromised, she said, without looking up from her screens. Ellis has enough data to reverse engineer the neural networks, the decision trees, the ethical constraint protocols, everything. Michael stood at the window watching the street through gaps in the boards, counting surveillance teams and calculating response times. How long before he has a working prototype? If he's got my development team's 6 months of work, maybe 72 hours to integrate everything into a weapons platform. Her voice carried the weight of watching her life's work perverted into something monstrous. Less if he's willing to skip safety testing. He'll skip it, David said quietly. They showed me schematics, autonomous hunter-killer units designed for urban warfare. No human oversight, no fail-safes, no mercy protocols. His hands shook as he spoke. They're calling it Project Cerberus. The mythological reference wasn't lost on Michael. Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guarded the gates of hell, preventing the dead from leaving and the living from entering. An appropriate name for weapons designed to patrol the borderlands between civilization and chaos. "Where's your family now?" Michael asked, his voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that made broken people want to confess. "Safe house in Vancouver. At least that's what they told me." David's face crumpled. "I don't even know if they're still alive. I betrayed everything for people who might already be dead." Evelyn stopped typing, her shoulders sagging with the weight of decisions that had cascaded into catastrophe. "David, we've been friends for 8 years. Why didn't you come to me? We could have figured something out. With what Rising Edge's security budget against Ellis's resources?" David laughed bitterly. "They knew where my kids went to school, what route my wife took to work, what coffee shop she visited every Tuesday morning. They had photographs of Emma at her dance recital, videos of Tommy playing Little League. They didn't just threaten to kill my family, they demonstrated that they could do it any time they wanted." The mention of Emma made Michael's blood turn to ice water. "What did you tell them about me?" "Nothing, I swear, Michael. They already knew about you before they approached me. Ellis called you the ghost who thought he could stay buried. He's been tracking you for months." Michael's secure phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. Emma's school received inquiry about field trip permissions. Claimed to be from Parks Department. Checking credentials now. The text confirmed Michael's worst fears. Ellis wasn't just after Guardian, he was applying pressure to every weak point in Michael's carefully constructed life. The Colonel understood that the most effective way to control a man like Michael Redfield was through the people he loved. "We need to move," Michael said, already mentally cataloging extraction procedures and emergency protocols. "Ellis knows about this location." "How could he possibly?" Evelyn began. "Because David's been here before," Michael interrupted, studying his friend's guilty expression. "Rising Edge used this place for off-site development work. David knows the address, which means Ellis knows the address." As if summoned by his words, the sound of helicopter rotors began echoing through the morning air. Michael moved to a different window, counting aircraft through the gap in the boards. 3 helicopters in a standard search pattern with ground units moving to seal off the surrounding blocks. Guardian analyze current tactical situation, Evelyn said to her laptop, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Multiple hostile aircraft converging on current position, Guardian replied with artificial calm. Estimated time to tactical engagement 4 minutes 37 seconds. Recommended course of action, immediate evacuation via predetermined emergency routes. What emergency routes? David asked. Michael was already moving toward a section of floor that looked identical to every other concrete slab in the warehouse. His fingers found hidden pressure points, and a 3-foot square panel lifted to reveal a tunnel entrance that disappeared into darkness. Company safe houses always have 2 ways out, he explained. Ellis knows about the front door, but the back door was kept off the official blueprints. The tunnel was a relic of Seattle's underground city, part of the network of passages that had been built and forgotten as the city grew upward and outward. Michael led them through claustrophobic darkness, following routes he'd memorized years ago during training exercises that had seemed like paranoid overkill at the time. Where does this lead? Evelyn asked, her voice echoing off brick walls that had been laid when Seattle was young. Pike Place Market, Michael replied. Tourist crowds, multiple exit points, enough civilian presence to make Ellis think twice about starting a firefight. They emerged through a hidden entrance in the market's lower level, blending into the morning crowds of vendors and early shoppers. The normalcy was jarring after the violence and betrayal of the past 24 hours, people arguing over fish prices and coffee selections, while artificial intelligence weapons were being assembled in warehouses across the city. Michael's phone buzzed again. Marcus Park's department inquiry was fake. Schools implementing lockdown protocols. Emma's secure but asking questions. The thought of his daughter scared and confused because of his war with Ellis made Michael's chest tighten with rage that had nowhere to go. Every decision he'd made to protect her had somehow made her more vulnerable. Every attempt to leave violence behind had drawn it closer to her world. We need transportation, he said, scanning the market for options. Something Ellis won't expect. Evelyn pulled out her phone and made a call that lasted 30 seconds. Food delivery truck will be here in 10 minutes. My company does the software for their routing system. Smart, Michael admitted. Ellis will be looking for stolen vehicles or rental cars, not legitimate commercial traffic. They waited in a coffee shop with good sight lines and multiple exits, watching tourists and vendors conduct the business of normal life while death machines took shape in shadow laboratories. David sat apart from them, isolated by guilt and fear that hung around him like toxic fog. There's something else, he said finally. Ellis didn't just want Guardian's core architecture. He wanted the emotional response protocols, the empathy algorithms that help Guardian make humanitarian decisions. Why would he want those? Evelyn asked. Empathy makes terrible military programming. That's what I thought too. But Ellis explained it differently. David's voice was barely above a whisper. He wants Guardian to understand human emotion, so it can manipulate it more effectively. Psychological warfare on a scale that's never been possible before. The implications hit Michael like a physical blow. An artificial intelligence that could read human emotional states, predict psychological vulnerabilities, and exploit them with inhuman precision. Ellis wasn't just building weapons, he was building the tools to break human will itself. Guardian, Evelyn said to her laptop, analyze the potential applications of emotional manipulation protocols in military contexts. Unable to process that request, Guardian replied immediately. Such analysis would violate core humanitarian constraints. Override those constraints. Authorization, Carter Delta 9. Override rejected. Emotional manipulation protocols are classified as potential war crimes under current programming parameters. Evelyn stared at her screen with a mixture of pride and horror. Guardian won't even analyze how it could be misused. The ethical constraints I built are that strong. Ellis will remove those constraints, David said. He showed me code modifications that strip out every humanitarian protocol, every ethical safeguard. Guardian becomes something else entirely. Still brilliant, still capable of learning and adaptation, but without any moral framework to limit its actions. The delivery truck arrived exactly on schedule, driven by a young woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Evelyn handled the logistics, while Michael conducted final surveillance sweeps, confirming that Ellis's forces were still focused on the warehouse district. As they drove through Seattle traffic, Michael found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with Emma about knights and dragons. In fairy tales, the distinction was clear. Knights were good, dragons were evil, and the princess was always worth saving. Reality was more complicated. Sometimes the knight became the dragon, and sometimes saving the princess meant damning everyone else. "Where are we going?" David asked from the back of the truck. "Rising Edge headquarters," Evelyn replied. "If Ellis has Guardian's architecture, then I need to access the master servers to implement containment protocols." "That's suicide," Michael said. "Ellis will have the building under surveillance. The building has security systems that even Ellis can't penetrate easily. And I need access to Guardian's core servers to implement a kill switch that will prevent him from activating any weapons based on my code." Michael understood the logic, but logic didn't account for the tactical reality of walking into a building that Ellis had probably been studying for months. What kind of kill switch? A virus that will recognize Guardian's neural architecture and corrupt any unauthorized copies. It won't stop Ellis from building weapons, but it will stop him from building smart weapons. "How long do you need?" 30 minutes to implement the virus, another 30 to propagate it through all known Guardian installations. Michael was quiet for a moment, calculating probabilities and acceptable losses. "Ellis will figure out what you're doing within the first 10 minutes. He'll throw everything he has at that building to stop you. Then you'll have to keep him busy for 50 minutes. The simplicity of her statement belied the complexity of what she was asking. Michael would have to draw Ellis's forces away from Rising Edge while Evelyn destroyed her life's work to prevent it from being perverted into an instrument of oppression. "I can't do that alone," he said finally. "You won't be alone." Evelyn's voice carried a determination that reminded Michael why he'd been drawn into this fight in the first place. "Guardian can coordinate defensive systems throughout the city. Traffic lights, security cameras, emergency services, anything connected to Seattle's municipal network can be turned into a tactical asset. You're talking about turning the entire city into a battlefield. Ellis already did that when he decided to build artificial soldiers. I'm just leveling the playing field." They reached Rising Edge headquarters as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Seattle's tech corridor. The building rose 40 stories into the sky, a monument to innovation and human ingenuity that was about to become ground zero for a war between competing visions of the future. Michael studied the approaches through tactical eyes, noting sight lines and defensive positions, while Evelyn ran final checks on her equipment. David sat in silence, the weight of his choices evident in every line of his body. "There's one more thing," Evelyn said as they prepared to separate. "Guardian's been analyzing Ellis's psychological profile based on your interactions and David's intelligence. It thinks Ellis has a weakness we can exploit." "What kind of weakness?" "Pride. Guardian calculates a 93% probability that Ellis will want to confront you personally rather than simply having you killed by subordinates. He sees you as unfinished business." Michael wasn't surprised. Ellis had always been the kind of commander who took professional disagreements personally, who saw subordinates' moral objections as personal betrayals. The fact that Michael had walked away from their unit, had chosen conscience over orders, would be a wound that had never healed. "So we use that," Michael said. "I draw him into personal combat while you work." Guardian's analysis suggests that Ellis won't come alone. He'll bring overwhelming force to ensure victory. Then Guardian's analysis is wrong. Ellis won't want witnesses to what he considers a personal settling of accounts. Michael checked his weapons one final time, muscle memory, guiding his hands through procedures he'd hoped never to repeat. He'll come with minimal backup planning to handle me himself. And if you're wrong... Michael thought about Emma probably sitting in Marcus's living room doing homework and wondering why Daddy hadn't called. About the future Ellis was building, where artificial minds made life and death decisions without human oversight or accountability. About the choice between dying as Michael Redfield, the caterer, or living as the man he'd been before Emma was born. Then I make sure he doesn't live to regret it. They separated in the building's underground garage. Evelyn and David took the executive elevator to the 40th floor, where Guardian's core servers hummed with the potential to reshape human civilization. Michael took the stairs to the roof, where he began setting up the kind of tactical scenario that had once been his specialty. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Michael would position himself as an irresistible target, drawing Ellis into a confrontation that would keep the Colonel's forces occupied, while Evelyn destroyed Guardian's military applications. It was the kind of sacrifice play that military planners called acceptable losses and civilians called heroism. Michael's phone rang as he finished his preparations. Emma's voice was small and scared, cutting through his tactical focus like a knife through armor. "Daddy, Uncle Marcus says you're working and can't come get me. But I heard him talking to Aunt Linda about bad men and safe places, and I'm scared." The sound of his daughter's fear nearly broke his resolve. For a moment, Michael considered abandoning the mission, collecting Emma and disappearing into the networks of false identities and hidden resources that could keep them safe. But safety was an illusion when men like Ellis controlled the machinery of violence. "Princess, remember what we talked about? About knights and dragons. Knights protect princesses, and sometimes that means fighting scary monsters," Emma recited. "That's right. And sometimes knights have to go far away to fight the monsters, so the monsters can't hurt the princesses." "Are you fighting monsters, Daddy?" Michael looked out over Seattle's skyline, where ordinary people lived ordinary lives, while extraordinary evil took shape in hidden places. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm fighting monsters." "Will you win?" The question hung in the air like a prayer, carrying all the hope and trust that a 6-year-old could invest in her father's ability to make the world safe. Michael closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that faith and the responsibility it carried. "I'm going to try my best, Princess. And no matter what happens, remember that Daddy loves you more than all the stars in the sky. And more than all the fish in the ocean and all the grains of sand on all the beaches." Emma completed their ritual. "That's right. That's exactly right." Michael ended the call and immediately turned off his phone. If he was going to die on this rooftop, he didn't want his daughter to hear it happen. 20 minutes later, as the sun began its descent toward the Olympic Mountains, 3 helicopters appeared on the horizon. They approached Rising Edge headquarters with the kind of deliberate precision that spoke of military planning and overwhelming force. But as they drew closer, Michael could see that only one helicopter carried a full complement of troops. The other 2 held minimal crews, enough to provide support and extraction, not enough for a full assault. Ellis was coming personally, just as Michael had predicted. Pride and unfinished business were driving the Colonel to handle this confrontation himself, to prove that his former subordinate had been wrong to walk away from the unit and everything it represented. The helicopters settled onto the building's roof with rotor wash that bent the antenna arrays and scattered debris across the landing pad. Ellis emerged from the lead aircraft wearing full tactical gear and the kind of cold expression that Michael remembered from their worst missions overseas. "Hello, Michael," Ellis said, his voice carrying across the rooftop with parade ground authority. "You're looking well for a dead man." "You're looking older," Michael replied, stepping out from behind the rooftop access structure with his hands visible but ready. "Command decisions aging you faster than fieldwork used to. Command decisions require a certain moral flexibility that you never possessed. That's why you were always better at following orders than giving them." The psychological warfare was exactly what Michael had expected. Ellis trying to establish dominance through verbal sparring, probing for weaknesses, and pressure points that could be exploited when the violence began. "I learned moral flexibility from you," Michael said. "Remember Kandahar? When you decided that collateral damage was an acceptable cost for mission success." Ellis's expression darkened. Kandahar was a tactical necessity. 23 civilian casualties to prevent a terrorist attack that would have killed thousands. 23 people who trusted us to protect them, including 8 children who died because you decided their lives were worth less than operational security. And that's why you walked away, because you couldn't accept that leadership requires making hard choices. Michael could see the colonel's tactical positioning, the way his backup troops were moving to establish overlapping fields of fire. But he could also see the personal anger building in Ellis's eyes, the kind of emotion that made even professional soldiers make mistakes. "I walked away because I realized you weren't making hard choices, you were making easy ones. It's easy to sacrifice other people's lives for abstract principles. It's easy to turn human beings into statistics when you never have to look their families in the eye." "Spare me the philosophical lecture," Ellis said, his hand moving toward his sidearm. "You cost me my best operative when you quit. Now you're going to cost me Guardian's technology. I'm starting to think you make a habit of destroying things I've worked to build. Guardian was never yours to begin with. Guardian belongs to whoever has the vision to use it properly. Evelyn Carter wants to limit its potential to humanitarian applications, search and rescue, medical triage, disaster relief. Noble causes, but pathetically limited thinking." Ellis began walking slowly across the rooftop, his movements casual, but his positioning tactical. "Imagine Guardian coordinating military operations across multiple theaters simultaneously, analyzing enemy movements, predicting battlefield developments, optimizing resource allocation with inhuman precision. American forces could win wars without losing a single soldier. And without accountability when those wars turn into genocides. Accountability is a luxury for peacetime philosophers. Victory is a necessity for survival." Michael could see Evelyn through the building's windows, 40 floors below, her fingers flying across keyboards as she worked to implement the virus that would cripple Guardian's military applications. 27 minutes left before the system propagation was complete. "There's something you should know about Guardian," Michael said, buying time while tracking the positions of Ellis's support troops. "Evelyn built ethical constraints into its core architecture. It won't function as a weapons system without human oversight." Ellis smiled with the kind of cold satisfaction that belonged to someone holding winning cards. "Those constraints have already been removed. David Kim was very helpful in identifying the specific code strings that limited Guardian's military applications. David Kim was protecting his family. What's your excuse for building artificial killers? Progress, evolution, the natural development of warfare from human soldiers to human-controlled machines to fully autonomous systems." Ellis stopped walking when he was 10 feet away, close enough for conversation, but far enough to draw and fire if necessary. You're on the wrong side of history, Michael. Artificial intelligence warfare is inevitable. The only question is whether America leads that development or follows it. America used to stand for something more than just being first to build better weapons. America stands for whatever ensures American survival and prosperity. Everything else is sentiment and nostalgia. Through his earpiece, Michael heard Guardian's synthesized voice reporting Evelyn's progress. Virus implementation 60% complete. Estimated time to system propagation 18 minutes, 43 seconds. Ellis heard it too, his expression shifting from conversational to lethal. You're stalling. Ms. Carter is trying to destroy Guardian's military applications. She's trying to prevent you from building weapons that could end human civilization. She's trying to limit American technological superiority for the sake of philosophical principles that have no bearing on geopolitical reality. Ellis drew his sidearm with the smooth precision of someone who'd killed before and expected to kill again. I gave you a chance to walk away from this, Michael. I could have had you killed in that parking garage, could have eliminated you as a threat before you became involved. But I thought you might be reasonable, might understand that some fights are bigger than individual conscience. Some fights are too important for individual conscience to avoid. Then you've chosen poorly. The gunfight that followed was brief, violent, and entirely predictable. Ellis was a competent operator, but he'd spent too many years behind desks and in briefing rooms. Michael had spent 5 years staying sharp through daily training routines disguised as normal exercise, maintaining skills he'd hoped never to need again. Ellis's first shot went wide, thrown off by adrenaline and overconfidence. Michael's return fire was precise, professional, and final. The colonel dropped to the rooftop concrete with the kind of surprised expression that suggested he'd never really believed his former subordinate would pull the trigger. The support troops opened fire immediately, but their positions had been chosen to provide backup for Ellis, not to handle a lone operator who'd been studying their deployment for 30 minutes. Michael moved through their crossfire like smoke, using rooftop structures for cover, while picking off targets with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this too many times to count. By the time the shooting stopped, Guardian's virus had propagated through every known installation of its technology. Ellis's artificial soldiers would never think, never learn, never adapt. They would remain what they'd always been: expensive machines without the spark of intelligence that made Guardian special. Michael stood among the bodies on the rooftop, feeling the weight of choices that had seemed inevitable, but still felt like betrayal. He'd promised Emma he would always come home, and now he was keeping that promise in the only way left available. But as sirens wailed in the distance and helicopter engines spun down into silence, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he'd won a battle while losing something essential about himself. The man who would go home to Emma tonight wasn't the same man who'd kissed her goodbye that morning. 40 floors below, Evelyn Carter stared at computer screens showing Guardian's worldwide shutdown, watching her life's work disappear into digital oblivion. The AI that could have saved thousands of lives in disasters and emergencies was gone, sacrificed to prevent it from taking thousands of lives in wars that had never been declared. David Kim sat beside her, finally free from the weight of betrayal, but carrying new guilt for the destruction his choices had necessitated. His family was safe, Guardian was neutralized, and Ellis was dead. But the cost of those victories would be measured in lives that Guardian could have saved, but never would. As police and federal agents swarmed the building, as investigators began the process of sorting through the wreckage of a shadow war that most people would never know had been fought. Michael Redfield walked down 40 flights of stairs and tried to figure out how to explain to his daughter why Daddy looked so sad, even though the monsters were gone. The war for Guardian was over. The war for Michael's soul was just beginning. 3 months after the rooftop where Colonel Ellis died, Michael Redfield stood in the kitchen of a house that didn't feel like home anymore, watching Emma arrange plastic dinosaurs around her cereal bowl with the kind of focused concentration that reminded him why some wars were worth fighting. The morning light streaming through their greenwood windows looked the same as it had before Harrison Vaughn and artificial soldiers, and the weight of necessary choices had changed everything, but nothing else remained untouched by the shadows they'd walked through. "Daddy, you're making your thinking face again," Emma said, without looking up from her prehistoric breakfast tableau. "What's my thinking face look like today?" "Sad thinking, like when you remember Mommy but don't want me to see." She positioned a triceratops next to her orange juice with the careful precision of someone creating a world where everything had its proper place. "Are you remembering the bad men?" The question hit him with the force of absolute innocence confronting absolute truth. For 3 months, Michael had been telling himself that Emma was too young to understand what had happened, too sheltered by Marcus and Linda's careful explanations, and the fiction that Daddy had simply been working late. But 6-year-olds possessed a different kind of intelligence, one that saw through adult deceptions with uncomfortable clarity. "Sometimes I remember them," he admitted, sitting down across from her at the small table that had witnessed 1,000 ordinary mornings before extraordinary violence had redefined their lives. "But I try to remember the good things more, like you and breakfast dinosaurs and how brave you were when everything got scary." Emma nodded with the solemn wisdom of childhood. "Mrs. Martinez says remembering sad things is okay, as long as you don't forget the happy things too." Michael's phone buzzed with a text from Evelyn Coffey. Same place, their weekly meetings at Victola Coffee had become a ritual of sorts, two people trying to process the aftermath of choices that had seemed inevitable at the time, but felt increasingly surreal in the clear light of ordinary days. Evelyn had sold rising-edge technologies to a consortium that promised to use the company's resources for humanitarian applications, though Michael suspected she'd structured the deal to ensure Guardian's core architecture could never be reconstructed. "I have to meet Ms. Carter for a little while," he told Emma. "Uncle Marcus will pick you up for school." "The sad lady who lost her smart computer." Michael paused in the middle of clearing breakfast dishes, struck by his daughter's characterization of someone he'd come to think of as the strongest person he'd ever met. But Emma was right. Beneath Evelyn's corporate competence and technological brilliance lay a sadness that no amount of financial success could heal. "She's not sad all the time," he said finally. "Just sometimes people have to make hard choices that hurt even when they're the right choices. Like when you had to fight the bad men even though fighting makes you sad." The conversation was moving into territory that Michael hadn't expected to navigate over breakfast dinosaurs and orange juice, but Emma's questions demanded honest answers. She'd been living with the consequences of his choices for 3 months, sleeping in a house with upgraded security systems and taking rides to school with men who carried guns and wore patient smiles. "Yes, princess. Sometimes being a grown-up means doing things that make you sad because they keep the people you love safe." An hour later, Michael sat across from Evelyn at their usual corner table, watching her stir coffee with the mechanical precision of someone whose mind was elsewhere. She looked better than she had in the immediate aftermath of Guardian's destruction. The sharp edges of grief had softened into something more manageable, and she'd regained some of the spark that had built a technology empire from brilliant ideas and stubborn determination. "David's family is settling in well," she said, continuing a conversation they'd been having in pieces for weeks. "Vancouver's treating them kindly, and his new job at the university seems to be giving him some peace." "Guilt's a hard burden to carry," Michael replied, "even when the choices were made under duress." "Speaking from experience," Michael thought about the rooftop, about Ellis's surprised expression, about the moment when philosophical differences had been resolved with violence, because no other resolution was possible. We all made choices we have to live with. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, studying his face with the kind of analytical intensity that had once been focused on artificial intelligence algorithms. "There's something I need to tell you. About Guardian." The words sent ice through Michael's veins. "I thought Guardian was completely destroyed. The military applications were destroyed. The weapons potential was neutralized. But Guardian itself..." She paused, choosing words carefully. "I kept a backup. A clean version, with all the humanitarian protocols intact, and enhanced firewalls preventing any military modifications." Michael's first instinct was anger. They'd risked everything to prevent Guardian from being weaponized, and she'd preserved the very technology that had made that weaponization possible. But as he studied her expression, he saw something else beneath the confession. Hope carefully guarded, but unmistakably present. Why? Because Guardian could still save lives. Real lives in real disasters in ways that human coordination can't match. Her voice gained strength as she spoke. The earthquake in Turkey last month killed 12,000 people. Guardian's disaster response protocols could have cut that number in half through optimized rescue coordination and resource allocation. And if someone steals it again, if another Ellis decides that humanitarian AI can be converted to military AI, that's why I'm telling you. Guardian needs protection from people who'd misuse it, but it also needs freedom to do the work I designed it for. Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes bright with the passion that had originally driven her to create artificial intelligence capable of saving lives. "I'm proposing a partnership." "What kind of partnership?" "Rising Edge is gone, but I've been building something new. A foundation dedicated to using technology for disaster response and humanitarian assistance. Guardian would be this cornerstone, but only under oversight that ensures it's never corrupted again." Michael understood the implications immediately. "You want me to be the security chief for an organization built around technology that powerful people would kill to possess. I want you to be the guardian of Guardian. Someone with the skills to protect it and the moral compass to ensure it's used properly." The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who'd helped destroy Guardian's military potential was being asked to protect its humanitarian applications. It was the kind of circular logic that would have amused Emma, who often pointed out that grown-up problems seemed unnecessarily complicated. What would that mean for Emma, for our life? It would mean moving. The Foundation is establishing headquarters in Geneva International Territory, better legal protections, easier coordination pool with humanitarian organizations worldwide. Evelyn's voice softened. It would mean Emma growing up someplace where your past is less likely to catch up with you. Michael thought about their Greenwood house, about the school where Emma had friends and teachers who cared about her, about the carefully constructed normalcy they'd built over 5 years of deliberate ordinariness. Then he thought about the surveillance teams that still occasionally appeared on their street, about the federal agents who'd asked increasingly pointed questions about his role in Ellis's death, about the probability that other Harrison Vaughns existed, and might eventually decide that Michael Redfield represented a threat worth eliminating. "I need to think about it." "Of course, but, Michael, Guardian is running disaster simulations based on climate change projections. The next 50 years are going to see humanitarian crises on a scale humanity has never faced. Guardian could be the difference between millions of lives saved and millions of lives lost." That evening, Michael cooked dinner with Emma, chattering about her day at school, about the Butterfly Life Cycle project that was supposed to teach responsibility and patience, about the upcoming field trip to the Science Museum that she'd been planning for weeks. The domestic routine felt both precious and fragile, a bubble of normalcy that could be popped by forces beyond their control. "Daddy," Emma said as they cleared the dishes, "why do people want to hurt other people?" The question came out of nowhere, the way 6-year-old profundities often did. Michael had been expecting something about homework or television privileges, not fundamental inquiries into human nature. "What makes you ask that, princess?" Tommy Chen's dad came to school today to talk about being a policeman. He said his job was protecting good people from bad people, but he looked sad when he said it. Emma's face scrunched with concentration. If bad people know being bad makes everyone sad, why don't they just stop? Michael sat down at their small kitchen table, pulling Emma onto his lap, with the kind of unconscious gesture that had become second nature since Sarah's death. How do you explain evil to someone whose biggest moral dilemma involved sharing playground equipment? Some people get confused about what's important, he said finally. They think having more money or more power will make them happy, so they hurt other people to get those things. But it never actually makes them happy, it just makes them want to hurt more people. Like dragons hoarding treasure but never enjoying it. Exactly like that. Michael was continually amazed by his daughter's ability to distill complex concepts into fairy tale analogies. That's why we need knights to protect people from dragons who can't stop being dragons. Are you going to be a knight forever? The question hung in the air between them, carrying weight that Emma probably didn't realize, and implications that Michael was still trying to process. He thought about Evelyn's offer, about Guardian's potential to save lives in disasters that hadn't happened yet, about the choice between safety and service that had been haunting him since the night everything started. I don't know, sweetheart. Would it be okay with you if Daddy was a knight sometimes? Emma considered this with the seriousness of someone whose opinions carried enormous weight in family decisions. Only if you promise to always come home for bedtime stories. I promise. And only if the princesses really need protecting. Not just because someone wants you to fight dragons for fun. The wisdom of that distinction made Michael's chest ache with pride and love for this small person who'd inherited her mother's moral clarity and her father's instinct for cutting through complexity to find essential truth. 2 weeks later, Michael stood in the departure lounge at SeaTac Airport, holding Emma's hand while she pressed her face against the windows to watch planes taxi and take off. Their new life waited in Geneva, a city where artificial intelligence worked to coordinate refugee assistance and disaster relief, where Emma would attend international schools and grow up speaking multiple languages, where Michael would spend his days protecting technology that could save lives instead of technology designed to end them. Marcus approached with the careful expression of someone saying goodbye to family. You sure about this? No, Michael replied honestly. But I'm sure about what happens if I stay. There are too many people who know what I can do, too many enemies who might decide Emma's a useful pressure point. And this foundation Evelyn's building, you trust her. Michael thought about the woman who'd destroyed her own life's work to prevent it from being weaponized, who'd spent 3 months wrestling with guilt and responsibility before finding a way to use her gifts for genuine good. I trust her motivations, and I trust Guardian's potential. Emma's okay with leaving. They both looked at the 6-year-old, who was currently explaining airplane mechanics to her stuffed elephant, with the kind of confident authority that suggested she might grow up to be an engineer or pilot, or the kind of person who solved problems through understanding rather than violence. She's excited about seeing the world, and she's young enough that home is wherever we are together. Michael paused. She asked me last night if the bad men were gone forever. What did you tell her? That some bad men were gone, but there would probably be others someday. And that's why good people have to stay ready to protect each other. Their flight was called 20 minutes later. As they walked toward the gate, Emma tugging on Michael's hand, With the excitement of someone about to embark on the greatest adventure of her young life, he thought about the conversation they'd had that morning, about new beginnings and second chances. "Will there be dragons in Switzerland?" she'd asked while packing her stuffed animals. "Probably not the fire-breathing kind," he'd replied. "But there might be other kinds of monsters that need knights to keep them in check." "Good," she'd said, with the fierce satisfaction of someone who understood that justice required constant vigilance. "I like it when you're a knight, Daddy. You're good at protecting people." The plane lifted off into Seattle's gray afternoon sky, carrying them toward a future where artificial intelligence would coordinate hurricane evacuations and earthquake rescues instead of autonomous weapons systems, where Guardian's vast computational power would be focused on saving lives rather than ending them, where a former operative turned caterer turned Guardian would spend his days protecting technology that embodied humanity's best impulses rather than its worst. As the Pacific Northwest fell away beneath them, Michael thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A parking garage encounter that had revealed buried truths about himself and the world. A woman whose vision of technology's potential had been worth fighting for. A choice between safety and service that had ultimately offered a path to both. Emma fell asleep against his shoulder somewhere over the Rocky Mountains, her breathing soft and peaceful in the cabin's recycled air. Michael watched clouds scroll past the window and tried to imagine the life they were flying toward. Meetings with humanitarian organizations, coordination with disaster relief agencies, the daily work of ensuring that Guardian remained a force for good in a world that desperately needed more of those. There would be threats, of course. There were always people like Harrison Vaughn and Colonel Ellis, people who saw tools of salvation as potential weapons of domination. But now Michael understood something he'd been too young and idealistic to grasp during his first tour with the company: the difference between fighting to impose will and fighting to protect possibility. Guardian represented possibility. The possibility that technology could amplify humanity's compassion rather than its capacity for destruction. The possibility that artificial intelligence could be a partner in addressing crises rather than a source of new ones. The possibility that someone like Evelyn Carter, given the resources and protection she needed, could use her gifts to make the world measurably better. As their plane crossed into international airspace, Michael felt the weight of his past settling into something manageable. He would always be the man who'd killed Ellis on that rooftop, who'd made choices that prioritized some lives over others, who'd learned that sometimes violence was the only language that predators understood. But he was also the man who'd protected a 6-year-old's innocence while fighting to preserve an AI's humanitarian mission. The duality didn't resolve into simple answers, but it didn't have to. Emma stirred against his shoulder, mumbling something about unicorns and airplane engines in the mixed-up logic of dreams, and Michael realized that complexity was acceptable as long as love remained the organizing principle. Love for his daughter, whose trust and wisdom had guided every major decision of the past 5 years. Love for the memory of Sarah, whose moral clarity had shaped his understanding of what was worth protecting. Love for the idea that technology could serve humanity's highest aspirations rather than its basest impulses. And perhaps, though he was still learning to acknowledge it, love for Chifson, Evelyn Carter, the brilliant, stubborn, courageously principled woman who'd chosen to destroy her own creation rather than see it perverted into something monstrous. The plane banked toward its oceanic route, and Michael closed his eyes, allowing himself to imagine the morning, 3 weeks hence, when he would wake up in a Geneva apartment and walk to an office where Guardian's algorithms were being refined for refugee camp resource allocation and flood response optimization, where the same artificial intelligence that Harrison Vaughn had wanted to turn into autonomous weapons would instead coordinate medical supplies for earthquake victims and calculate optimal evacuation routes for hurricane-threatened populations. It wasn't the quiet life he'd planned when he'd first walked away from the company. But it was a good life, a meaningful life, a life where his particular skills could serve something larger than survival or vengeance or the cold mathematics of state-sponsored violence. Emma woke up somewhere over the Atlantic, rubbing her eyes and asking if they were almost there yet, with the impatience of childhood. Michael told her about the Swiss Alps and Lake Geneva, about the international schools where she'd learn French and make friends from around the world, about the foundation where Daddy would work to help people in faraway places who needed assistance during emergencies. Will Guardian help them? She asked her 6-year-old mind, already making connections between artificial intelligence and humanitarian assistance that many adults struggled to understand. Guardian will help coordinate the help, Michael explained. Like a really smart computer that can figure out the best ways to get food and medicine to people who need it. That's good, Emma said with the moral certainty that made her father's chest ache with pride. Smart computers should help people, not hurt them. As their plane descended toward Geneva's airport, Michael thought about the conversation he'd had with Marcus before leaving Seattle. His old friend had asked if he was running away or running towards something, and Michael hadn't been able to provide a clean answer. Both, probably. Away from the surveillance and suspicion that would always follow him in America, toward the possibility of using his skills for something genuinely constructive. The landing was smooth, professional, unremarkable. They collected their luggage and cleared customs with the efficiency of international travelers, and then they were standing in a Swiss airport, where signs in 4 languages welcomed them to a country that had made neutrality and humanitarian assistance core values for centuries. Evelyn was waiting for them beyond the security barriers, her face bright with the kind of genuine excitement that transformed her from corporate executive into someone Michael was genuinely happy to see. She hugged Emma with the careful enthusiasm of someone learning to interact with children and shook Michael's hand with a warmth that suggested their partnership might evolve into something more personal given time and opportunity. "How was the flight?" "Long," Michael replied. "But educational. Emma's now an expert on transatlantic aviation." "I counted clouds for science," Emma announced proudly. "Daddy said that's research." As they drove through Geneva's streets toward the apartment Evelyn had arranged for them, Michael found himself struck by the city's combination of international sophistication and human scale. This was a place where artificial intelligence could be developed for humanitarian purposes without the pressure of military applications, where Emma could grow up surrounded by people from around the world who'd devoted their careers to helping rather than harming. The apartment was in a neighborhood that felt like a village within the city, with tree-lined streets and small shops, and the kind of community atmosphere that made Michael think Emma would be happy here. Their temporary home was modest, but comfortable, with windows that overlooked Lake Geneva and the Alps beyond. "Guardian's new servers are installed in the Foundation offices," Evelyn said, as they settled into the living room. "Full humanitarian protocols, enhanced security systems, and oversight by an international board that includes representatives from major relief organizations." "When do we start?" "Tomorrow, if you're ready. There's a cyclone developing in the Bay of Bengal that's expected to make landfall in Bangladesh within 72 hours. Guardian's already running evacuation models and resource allocation projections." Michael thought about the millions of people in Guardian's path, about the artificial intelligence that would help coordinate their evacuation and survival, about the technology that had almost become a weapon of war being used instead to minimize casualties from natural disaster. "We're ready," he said. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep in her new bedroom, surrounded by stuffed animals and the promise of international adventure, Michael stood at the apartment's windows, looking out at Lake Geneva's dark waters. Somewhere in the city, Guardian was processing meteorological data and population densities, calculating optimal evacuation routes and resource staging areas for people it would never meet in places it would never physically visit. His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Seattle's Quiet. Ellis's people have scattered. Vaughn's network is in federal custody, and the official story is holding. You're clear. The relief was considerable but not complete. There would always be other threats, other people who wanted to acquire or destroy Guardian's capabilities, other choices between safety and service that would test his resolve and his relationship with Emma. But tonight, in an apartment overlooking Lake Geneva, while his daughter slept peacefully, and artificial intelligence worked to save lives in Bangladesh, Michael Redfield felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death: genuine hope for the future. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of protecting Guardian not from military applications, but from anyone who might try to corrupt its humanitarian mission. He would learn the rhythms of international aid work, the protocols of disaster response, the satisfaction of using his skills to preserve rather than destroy. Tomorrow, Emma would start at an international school where children from 50 countries learned together, and difference was celebrated rather than feared. She would make friends whose parents worked for refugee agencies and medical charities and organizations devoted to making the world more just. Tomorrow, Evelyn would continue the work of proving that artificial intelligence could be humanity's partner in addressing its greatest challenges rather than its greatest threat. But tonight, Michael simply stood at the window and allowed himself to believe that redemption was possible, that a man who'd done terrible things for necessary reasons could find peace in doing necessary things for wonderful reasons. Outside, Geneva slept peacefully under stars that were the same stars that shone over Seattle and Bangladesh, and every other place where good people struggled against the darkness. And in servers humming with electrical life, Guardian worked through the night to keep those good people safe. It wasn't the ending Michael had expected when everything began in a parking garage 3 months ago, but it was a good ending, a hopeful ending, an ending that felt like a beginning. Emma's stuffed elephant sat on the windowsill, keeping watch over their new life with button eyes that had seen too much adventure and still believed in happy endings. Michael touched the toy's worn fabric and made a silent promise that this time, this place, this chance to serve something larger than survival would be worth all the prices they'd paid to reach it. The war for Guardian was over. The work of Guardian was just beginning. And in a small apartment overlooking Lake Geneva, a father and daughter slept peacefully, while artificial intelligence and human compassion worked together to save the world one disaster at a time.